Hey Jexiteers, thanks again for stopping by. If you're new to this channel, my name is Riley and I'm a former Jehovah's Witness. Today I'd like to talk about another thing that I really cannot stand about the Watchtower organization, and that is their refusal to take responsibility for their mistakes. I can't think of any situation where taking responsibility for one's mistakes is not the right thing to do. Even more so for an organization like Watchtower that has such control over its members' lives. The potential for ruining those lives is absolutely immense. So the bigger the potential for harming people's lives, the more important it is to take responsibility for your mistakes. But again and again and again, Watchtower fails. Actually, it refuses to do this. So today I'm going to take you through my list of the top 5 things that Watchtower refuses to accept responsibility for. Before we jump into the list, I've just got to say that this list is in no particular order for the reason that these things are just so bad. Every single one of them is just so bad. It was extremely difficult ranking them in any kind of order. So I just decided not to do it at all. So the order is just completely random. Also, if you're doing your own research on the subjects I mentioned in this video, please check the video description where I've cited all of my sources and provided links wherever possible. Okay, let's go. So first up, we have failed predictions. As I'm sure most of you know, the Watchtower organization has failed to predict the end of the world several times, the most notably of these being in the year 1975. The failed prediction of 1975 is such a huge scandal that it deserves an entire video all of its own. That's something that I'll probably do at a later date. But for now, let's just focus on how the whole 1975 debacle was handled. Okay, so I'm going to give you a brief bit of background. In the year 1966, the Watchtower organization started heavily promoting the idea that Armageddon, or at the very least the start of the Great Tribulation, would happen in the year 1975. The reason for this is that some bright spark in the governing body calculated that the year 1975 would mark the end of 6,000 years since Adam was created. So from 1975 onward would be a seventh millennium. And as we all know, the number 7 has significance in the Bible according to Watchtower doctrine. So hence Armageddon 1975. Now, I'm fortunate enough to know witnesses and ex-witnesses who were around in the years leading up to 1975. And they have described to me the atmosphere at length, what it was actually like being a witness at that time in expectation of this momentous year. There were witnesses who sold their homes, quit their jobs, lived in caravans, all so that they could make their life as simple as possible to devote more time to the preaching work in expectation of this year, 1975. Many witnesses made huge life decisions because they believed wholeheartedly that the world was going to end in 1975. But then 1975 came and went, and we're all still here. Now, in the years following 1975, there was a mass exodus from the organization. Many witnesses just left the religion in disgust. So how did the governing body respond to this situation? They blamed the witnesses. They blamed individual brothers and sisters and said that they were basically getting carried away, running ahead of the organization and jumping to conclusions. So any difficult circumstances they found themselves in because of the decisions they made, that was on them. That was their own fault for getting carried away and running ahead of the organization. We never told you the world was going to end in 1975. We just said that 1975 was going to be a special year and you drew your own conclusions. That was the attitude of a governing body. And to be honest with you, that was what I believed. Obviously, I wasn't around in 1975, but when I asked questions about what happened That was the narrative that I was given. Oh, the society hinted that 1975 was going to be a special year, and then brothers and sisters jumped to conclusions and thought that 1975 would be Armageddon. Now, while it's true that the organization didn't explicitly say Armageddon is coming in 1975, they hinted at it to such an extent that if you didn't believe that Armageddon was coming in 1975, then there was something wrong with you. You clearly weren't listening. And we can prove this. As I said at the beginning, please check the description of this video for links to references where it's clearly shown that the governing body were pushing this 1975 idea very, very strongly. So please do that in your own time. I'm just going to play you a brief clip of an excerpt from a talk that was given at a district convention. Now, the year was 1967 in the Wisconsin-Sheboygan district in the United States. And the speaker is a district overseer by the name of Charles Sinutko. Listen to what he had to say.
Well, now, as Jehovah's Witnesses, as runners, even though some of us have become a little weary, it almost seems as though Jehovah has provided meat in due season, because he's held up before all of us a new goal, a new year, something to reach out for, and it just seems it's given all of us so much more energy and power in this final burst of speed for the finish line. And that's the year 1975. The Watchtower has been very explicit as to what the year 1975 means for us. If you wish to write down the page 262 in the 1967 issue of the Watchtower, we read, "What does the year 1975 mean for humankind? The end of 6,000 years of human existence, and possibly the time when God executes the wicked and starts off a 1,000-year reign under his Son, Jesus Christ." Unquote. As one brother put it, stay alive to 75.
Now, in 1980, the organization did print a very half-hearted retraction in which they basically reaffirmed what they said before. It was individual brothers and sisters being too keen and too eager and running ahead of the organization. But they also said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that along with printing information hinting at 1975, they also printed other information that advised witnesses to be cautious with their expectations surrounding certain dates, but that witnesses ultimately took to heart, to a greater degree, the information around 1975 rather than the cautionary advice. Now, this doesn't even come close to resembling accepting responsibility for getting everyone's hopes up. The lives of many, many people were impacted in a very negative way as a result of this false prediction. I personally know an elder, he's still an elder now, who is well past retirement age, but still works. Why? Because before 1975, he cashed in his pension. Now, it is true that nobody told him he should do that, but when you run an organization that is so dictatorial in its doctrine and what it expects of its members, when you say jump, everyone's going to say how high. Even though this doesn't at all qualify as a retraction, it does go some way to acknowledging that a mistake was made, even if they're not saying that they made the mistake. And then at the 2017 Don't Give Up Regional Convention, this happened.
Years later, another test came our way. You see, back then, some were looking to a certain date as signifying the end of this old system of things. A few even went so far as selling their homes and quitting their jobs. I admit, I was ready to see this old system go away too. but something just didn't seem right. Both at meetings and in my personal study, I was reminded of what Jesus said. Nobody knows the day or hour. I was dedicated to Jehovah, not a date. After that year came and went, most of those who had wrong expectations made the needed adjustments, and they stayed. We didn't run away, and we didn't give up. We trusted in Jehovah.
Yeah, that happened. Not much more I can say about that. Victim blaming at its worst. This is a prime example of an organization rewriting its shameful history in the hopes that future generations will be completely ignorant of what happened. Okay, moving on. The next item we have on this list is organ transplants. I've touched on this briefly in an earlier video, which I will link up there. But basically, between the 1960s and the 1980s, the Watchtower organization changed its position on organ transplants several times. At one point they were allowed, and then another point they were not, and then at one point they were allowed again, and you get the idea. But the crazy thing is that at one point, receiving an organ transplant was a disfellowshipping offense. You could be disfellowshipped for receiving this particular kind of medical procedure. Now imagine this scenario. You're critically ill, you're in hospital, the doctors are telling you you need an organ transplant or you will die. Now at this point in time, organ transplants are not allowed by the Watchtower organization. But you accept the procedure, you receive the organ transplant, and you're subsequently disfellowshipped from the congregation. Now, the very next day after you're disfellowshipped, the organization switches position and organ transplants are now allowed. Now, a fair-minded person would rightly expect that disfellowshipping to be rescinded. But is that what happens? No, it's not. So you were disfellowshipped yesterday for something that is perfectly fine today. And if you want to come back into the congregation, you then have to go through the formal reinstatement process. Now imagine an even worse scenario. You're sick, critically ill in hospital. The doctors tell you you need an organ transplant or you're going to die. You refuse because at this point in time, organ transplants are not allowed by the organization. So sadly, you die. The very next day after you die, the society switches position again and organ transplants are now allowed. Sadly, this is too late for you because you're already dead. Do you see what I'm getting at here? The doctrinal flip-flopping is bad enough, but has the organization ever made a statement apologizing to people who were wrongly disfellowshipped or to people who have lost their loved ones because the governing body can't make up their minds whether something is allowed or not? Have they ever done that? No, they haven't. Now, I was raised to believe that Jehovah is a God of justice and that his ways are higher than man's ways and his thoughts are higher than man's thoughts. If all of those things are true, how can this happen in his one true organization? People either being disfellowshipped or even dying over doctrinal flip-flopping is bad enough. But then the injustice of not accepting responsibility for those mistakes or taking steps to correct them, that is just the height of injustice. Here in the UK, there have been some very high-profile cases where people were convicted based on a flawed process of forensic evidence. If memory serves, this happened in the case of sudden infant death syndrome, which is commonly known as cot death. So what happens when things like that come to light? Well, if people are convicted and sent to prison based on a flawed method of collecting evidence, all the cases where that flawed method was used, immediately go under review, so that if there are any miscarriages of justice, those cases can be corrected. And this is coming from imperfect humans, from Satan's wicked system that is supposed to be morally inferior than Jehovah God himself. Help me make it make sense. Okay, next up we have blood transfusions. The refusal of blood transfusions is probably one of the things that Jehovah's Witnesses are most famous for. But it wasn't until the year 1945 when the prohibition on blood transfusions was actually put into place. And then in 1961, blood transfusions became a disfellowshipping offence. Now, this prohibition was against accepting whole blood, which is made up of red cells, white cells, platelets and plasma, but it was also extended to minor blood components, which are called fractions. But then in the year 2000, the prohibition against accepting minor blood fractions was rescinded, so those components were okay. Again, the organization makes no apology to witnesses who were sanctioned for having received blood fractions prior to this prohibition being rescinded. Again, where is the accountability? Where's the acceptance of responsibility? And where is the justice? Okay, moving on. Next up, we have grounds for divorce. Before I start on this one, just want to give you a quick warning that this subject isn't going to be safe for children. So if there are any around, you might want to watch this at a later time or put some headphones in. Okay, so for the entire history of the organization, I think it's safe to say that adultery has been the only grounds for a scriptural divorce and subsequent remarriage. However, what constitutes adultery or fornication has changed many times within the organization. At one point, it was believed that the only thing that constituted adultery was heterosexual vaginal sex between a man and a woman. So to give you an example, if a man's wife had an affair with another woman, that didn't constitute adultery. So that was not scriptural grounds for divorce. Or if a woman's husband had a homosexual affair with a man, that wasn't grounds for divorce either. And to take it even further, if a woman's husband had an affair with a woman, but they engaged in anything other than vaginal sex, that was not considered adultery and was therefore not scriptural grounds to divorce and remarry. Now, at some point during the 70s, I believe, I'm not 100% sure on that, but I think it was in the 70s, this was changed. So the definition of adultery was expanded to include all sexual relations with somebody other than your spouse. Now, I'm currently reading the book Crisis of Conscience, written by Raymond Franz, who was a former governing body member, and he goes into great detail about this subject, the position that the governing body took, the subsequent change, and also the ramifications that this had on rank and file Jehovah's Witnesses who found themselves in this situation. Now, in his book, he relates this experience, which I'm just going to read it for you. I still remember sometime after the articles appeared, a letter that came in from a witness who some years before had discovered her husband having sexual relations with an animal. As she said, I couldn't live with a man like that, and she divorced him. Later, she remarried. The congregation then disfellowshipped her for so doing, as she was not scripturally free. After the Watchtower articles appeared, she now wrote and asked, in view of the changed position, something be done to clear her name of the reproach she had suffered as a result of the disfellowshipping action. I could only write her that the articles published were themselves a vindication of her course. Though again it had been satisfying to prepare the material acknowledging the organization's erroneous view and rectifying it, the sobering thought remained that this could never undo whatever harm the previous position had caused over decades of time, and only God knows to how many people. What a heartbreaking situation for this poor woman to be in. So when she divorced her husband, his act of infidelity wasn't considered to be adultery, so she had no scriptural grounds for divorce at that time. But she did it anyway because, honestly, who could continue living with their partner after finding out something like that? She later remarried and was disfellowshipped because in the eyes of the congregation she wasn't scripturally free. However, this sanction against her wasn't rescinded after the change in position. Again, where is the justice? Granted, the organisation did later acknowledge that they had gotten it wrong. But how does that help individual witnesses who are disciplined as a result of that incorrect stance, especially when the organisation doesn't take any action to correct those errors? As Raymond Franz wrote himself in his response to this particular woman, the fact that the organisation had printed its changed stance should be viewed as a vindication. No, it shouldn't. Do you know what that's like? That's like living with someone who slaps you in your face every single day, and then one day they announce that they're no longer going to slap you. You ask them for an apology for all the times they did slap you, and their response is, the fact that I'm not doing it anymore is apology enough. Is that the kind of justice that you'd expect from God's one true organisation? Now, the issue of child sex abuse within the Jehovah's Witness organisation is a huge, huge can of worms that again deserves its own video. But for the purpose of this video, I just want to focus on the organisation's refusal to accept responsibility where they have made failings, and also their refusal to take sufficient remedial action. Now, the organisation claims to be very proactive when it comes to protecting children from predators, but this is manifestly untrue. As we all know, paedophiles in the organisation aren't reported to the police by the organisation. They have a policy of leaving that decision solely in the hands of the victim or the victim's parents. When asked to implement policies and procedures to safeguard children, their default response is always, well, that's the parent's job. That's the parent's job. Even when the abuser is a member of the congregation with a position of authority in the congregation, it's still, that's the parent's job. That's the parent's job. They want to receive all of the credit for protecting children, but none of the blame when that protection fails. And nowhere is this more evident than in the findings of the Australian Royal Commission. The organisation in Australia has repeatedly refused to sign up to the Redress Scheme, which would provide support to abuse victims. This is absolutely appalling. I can't think of any good reason why you would not want to sign up to a scheme like this. Seriously, I've racked my brain trying to think of reasons why the organisation would be so stubborn so as to refuse this again and again and again. And the conclusion that I've come to is that it's a narcissistic organisation. Avoiding responsibility for one's failings and mistakes is a classic trait of narcissism. Also, I think another possible explanation is that this organisation doesn't understand the difference between responsibility and fault. This is the case with many individuals as well, unfortunately. Even if it's not your fault that something broke, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not your responsibility to fix it. And accepting responsibility for fixing the broken thing doesn't necessarily mean that you're admitting it was your fault. We all know that the organisation is highly culpable in many, if not most, of these child abuse cases. But for the sake of argument, let's just say that It isn't their fault institutionally. They're just unfortunate to have so many paedophiles in their organization. That doesn't mean that it's not their responsibility to fix the problem. And to refuse to do so would be a clear example of not understanding the difference between responsibility for fixing something that's broken and the blame for actually breaking the thing. Actually, I'll give you a personal example of this. So in the 80s, my dad worked at Harrods, which is if you're not in the UK, you may not be familiar with it. It's a huge department store in London. He was employed there as an electrician. Now, on the 17th of December 1983, he went to work as he usually did every morning, and he was on the roof fixing the Christmas lights when a bomb exploded. The bomb was planted by the IRA and 6 people subsequently died in the explosion. Fortunately, my dad survived. He wasn't too badly hurt, but he did, as a result of the blast, receive some damage to his hearing. In fact, his hearing was never really the same after that. It could have been a lot worse though. Imagine if he was completely deaf after that explosion. Now, the explosion wasn't his fault. He didn't plant the bomb, but it would have been his responsibility, had he lost his hearing, to learn sign language. Now, if he took that responsibility and went to sign language lessons in order to learn how to communicate again, would that have been, in and of itself, an admission of fault for the bomb blast? Would that have been an admission of guilt for planting the explosive? No, it wouldn't. So, accepting responsibility for fixing the problem is not the same thing as accepting blame for causing the problem. Why doesn't Watchtower get this? But anyway, as we all know, in many of these cases, the organization is actually to blame, as well as being responsible for rectifying the issue. But even if they weren't to blame, there would still be no good reason not to do every single thing within their power to set matters right. Okay, that's all I have for you. That is my list of the top 5 things that the Watchtower organization doesn't accept responsibility for. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and comment. That really helps with the channel. Not just my channel, but all XJW channels. Also, if you haven't already done so, please subscribe and feel free to share this video with anyone who you think could benefit from it. And also, please drop a comment below. Let me know what you would have put on this list. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.